Well, it's great to be with everybody today. So my name is Charles Clancy. I'm the Senior Vice President and General Manager for MITRE Labs. For those that aren't familiar with MITRE and sort of our inner workings, we run 6 federally funded research and development centers for the U.S. federal government and really span everything from defense, intelligence, treasury, commerce, homeland security, and kind of everything in between, transportation. And so topics of supply chain really are of keen interest to us because it's a thread that really unites all of the different key constituencies that we support through our FFRDCs. And MITRE Labs, we're really this sort of integrating component within MITRE that works across all of the different FFRDCs. And so when it comes to topics like supply chain, we can kind of bring our unique expertise and insights across really in a whole of government kind of way. And so today, so I lead MITRE Labs and wanted to share with the group, at least my thoughts on kind of where we are right now in supply chain and why is this event happening here and now and why do we care about it so much? And so first I'll observe that really globalization has led to these really tightly coupled supply chains, right? If you look up supply chain statistics, it's things like companies can double their profits if they can eke out an extra 5 or 6% of efficiency in their supply chain. And so there's huge economic pressure for, I'd say, industry as a whole to become increasingly efficient in the operation of their supply chains. And that results in everything from just-in-time delivery of components that are going to go into assembly. You want to minimize your warehousing time because things that are sitting in a warehouse aren't being monetized. There's a shift to offshoring a lot of the kind of low-end, more commodity components of the supply chain. Increasingly, that's manufacturing as a whole, but we've also seen things like semiconductors and other critically important industries increasingly offshored because of cost pressures. It costs 30 to 40% more to fab a chip here in the US than it does in China. And there's real economic pressures there to get more efficiencies out of your supply chain. And so I'd say over the last 20 years, really the speed of information, the connectivity of the internet, and all these macroeconomic pressures have led to pretty much every industry having a very diverse and finely tuned supply chain that is potentially more vulnerable because it lacks resilience. It lacks elasticity, and that creates risk for our economy as a whole. And I would say that up until maybe 5 years ago, we kind of had a global game theoretic balance that we'd kind of gotten into in terms of how we felt about macro trade issues. But I'd say there's been a series of things that have really thrown that whole balance really out of balance. If you looked, say, 10 years ago and you asked companies what was the biggest source of disruption to their supply chain, the number one answer globally was a factory fire. Right? I don't know that we have a panel on factory fires here, but that was the chief concern of supply chains previously. That was the number one disruption. What are the number one disruptions today? Extreme weather events. Climate change is having a direct impact on our supply chains. Hurricanes, flooding, these extreme weather events are one of the key concerns right now that are causing point disruptions in supply chains. Another one, cyber attack and ransomware, has become another leading cause of disruption, sort of point disruptions. I'm not talking about macro disruptions, I'll get to those in a second. But really disruptions in our supply chain. So I think it's important to realize that the risks that we've built in and to manage in the system are perhaps not the things that we should be most worried about at this point. So let's get to some of those macro disruptions, right? So what is really at a global scale affecting things? Well, certainly the pandemic was a huge part of it, right? You had massive changes in buying patterns of society. So we all sit at home and buy things on Amazon Prime. The dynamics of how people buy things changed and did so in a way that happened too quickly for the sort of control theoretic balances that exist within the market to correct. It just too much change too quickly. On top of that, we had labor shortages, right? People getting sick and out of the workforce. Labor shortage is another big point disruption for supply chains. But when you've got significant cross industries, people now out of the workforce. You've got major disruptions that happen, and those systemic disruptions result in really destabilizing the whole thing. And I'd say the second one, which I know is a major topic, I think that we'll get into throughout the course of the day, is our current sort of trade policy with China. China, of course, being a major source of many of our supply chains for everything we consume transit through China in one way or another, right? If you look at the modern iPhone, right, I think there are 700 different individual components that go into it, and more than half of them are come out of China. And so concerns over our sort of trade policy with China lead to significant concerns, I would say, with respect to supply chains. Well, what really is that concern over China being part of our supply chain? That concern also has been evolving considerably, I'd say, over the last several years. Historically, it was just seemed kind of, I don't know, economically bad for business, if you will, if we had significant imports from China in a way that seemed imbalanced. Certainly the last administration was very focused on things like measuring trade imbalance as a measure of relative economic success. And so we got to a position, I'd say, again, maybe 10 years ago, where there was, again, a big pushback to everything we buy at the store has a made in China sticker on the bottom of it, and that seems generally bad. But I would say we started to change our thinking, and it became a much more urgent national need, I'd say, around 2015. Lots of things happening around that time frame. I think one really interesting thing that happened was author Peter Singer published a book called Ghost Fleet that summer, which became at the top of every flag officer's reading list in the US military. And the premise of Ghost Fleet was really envisioning a future conflict with China that was really sort of motivated by some of these economic imbalances. But one of the key plot points was a microelectronics supply chain attack, where China basically was able to insert something into the F-35 supply chain that allowed them to disable our entire fleet of high-end fighters. And that crippled us in our ability to respond quickly to China. And it's interesting, around that time, we suddenly got very concerned about the risk of cybersecurity risk associated with things being manufactured in China. I don't know if there's a direct correlation there, but certainly it was the top of everyone's reading list that summer, and it really, I think, brought a lot of visibility to this as a potential area of concern. And so I'd say that amplified itself inside the Beltway here in DC. And we got really worried about the risk of things going into microelectronics in particular. There was Bloomberg did an article on the semiconductor supply chain where they thought they had sort of conclusive proof of malicious logic being embedded in motherboards that were being exported to the US and deployed into US data centers. And I think ultimately the cybersecurity industry ended up sort of debunking the claims in that report. But again, it presented a very sophisticated and capable adversary that was able to embed latent logic into the chips that we're buying and have those flow through the supply chain into US markets and be deployed into critical systems. And again, there was a lot of, while ultimately I think the claims in it were really debunked, and Bloomberg still stands behind the reporting, lots of reasons that kind of went into the back and forth on it. But again, it brought further attention to the concern and highlighted the risks. Around the same time, we began to see the rise of Huawei as a global supplier of telecommunications equipment, not just for older technologies in emerging markets, but increasingly the supplier of infrastructure to Europe in particular and parts of the United States. And so this concern over the cybersecurity risks of basically our telecom equipment being all manufactured in China really further reinforced this whole narrative. Now, there's lots of other things. Again, when you talk about Huawei, there's lots of interlinked components to this. There's concerns that much of the intellectual property that went into their products was stolen from companies like Cisco. Therefore, they had an unfair advantage in the market. there was concerns that espionage concerns. So if China also passed their series of laws, including their intelligence law, which basically gives the PLA and the Chinese intelligence services the authority to compel any Chinese company to work with them. And there was a lot of concern that those authorities, again, I think it was 2018 timeframe, would allow them to compel, say, Huawei to embed malicious code into their routers and base stations. Of course, China and Huawei dispute this and claim that there never was any malicious code. And it's interesting, there's never been a smoking gun necessarily found in Huawei source code. The UK government, for example, set up a whole group as part of their National Cybersecurity Center focused on doing verification and validation of the source code for Huawei products before they could be deployed into UK systems. And they found all kinds of problems with the code, none of it apparently malicious. There was just bad software engineering that went into it. It's interesting, there was a study that was done that found the Huawei firmware had, I think, 80 or 90 different copies of the same open source cryptography library in it, OpenSSL. And we'll get to SBOMs in a little while and talk about the software bill of material. But and half of them were vulnerable to known exploits, right? So in theory, there might be a way to leverage this knowledge to hack into that firmware. But is it because they did that intentionally, or they knew that there was some latent vulnerability they could exploit in the future? Or is it just a rush to get products to market and really sloppy software engineering practices? I don't know that we necessarily can differentiate. I think that's why it's important to talk about this from a risk management perspective. It's not just about necessarily the malicious intent of your adversary, but perhaps also the market pressures to get products to market faster lead to potentially more vulnerabilities in those products, independent of any intent behind the people who created them. So there was a big push a couple years ago, really, to try and push Huawei out of the market over concerns that that they could be used as a platform for espionage. Although we've not seen that. There was an interesting example. The African Union headquarters building did have a bunch of Huawei equipment installed that was found to be exfiltrating all kinds of audio and video recordings of all the sessions that were happening. And it was Huawei equipment that was being exfiltrated back to China, but again, unclear if Huawei had a hand in that or just the PLA did a supply chain attack against the Huawei equipment being delivered to the headquarters as part of a broader espionage campaign. Again, these are all sorts of interesting questions. And so, again, there was a big push to get basically Europe to, well, the US initially, and then Europe, and then parts of South America and other areas around the world to not adopt Huawei technology. Given the US was never really able to point to a smoking gun with respect to a clear example where Huawei had knowingly embedded malicious code into their products, I'd say the U.S. began to shift its narrative a little bit. We went more towards the economic rationale for why China is bad, right? So we went full circle, right? We started off with general trade imbalance concerns around economics. We went to cybersecurity, we went to espionage, and then we kind of went back to economic as the reason. Meanwhile, again, China was expanding through the Belt and Road Initiative, big ambitions globally to sell their products outside of China and really build a market presence throughout the world. And do so in some anti-competitive ways, certainly. But it now really shifted to this conversation about great power competition and the sort of the relative economic power of China versus the U.S. So I guess regardless of your rationale, it's bad for the U.S. for Huawei to be successful, and so we continue to push back against that. There's another debate kind of growing, which is really around the sort of the values that we want in the future of our technology, which is another part of the China narrative now. And it really gets to, over the last 20 years, we've seen the internet, which was a very decentralized, organic entity 20 years ago, really become very centralized, right? We have the rise of the hyperscalers here in the US. It's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, right? They own pretty much everything, right? The majority of internet traffic is delivered from one of their data centers over a fiber optic infrastructure that they own. And that is where you are spending the majority of your time, whether it's because it's a service that's hosted in one of their clouds or directly consuming one of their services. China has a similar ecosystem that's evolved around its hyperscalers, Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu. And the centralization of that tech has been good for China, right? It allows them to really build companies like Huawei at the lower layers of the stack, up through really leading the world in AI because they have access to large amounts of data and less concerns about how they use that data. That gets into things like TikTok, for example, right? There's a big debate resurging about whether or not we should ban TikTok here in the United States. And it was recently discovered that that anytime you open a web browser, a link within TikTok, the app embeds into the web page you're visiting all the spyware that's able to figure out any keystroke you type, username and password, anywhere you click on the page, all that data is harvested, collected, and sent back. And so there's a sort of significant privacy intrusion that's happening in TikTok. And the question is, how do we feel about that? Certainly, US hyperscalers are doing similar things. The ad ecosystem that basically pays for the internet today has lots of unsavory aspects to it. But is it a national security concern? I guess it's still an interesting open question. So, I mean, right now we're kind of in this interesting debate around really the future of the internet and who owns it, and is there a Chinese internet and a U.S. internet, and how does that affect our technology supply chains? It gets really interesting. So, what do we do about this? We've seen some significant transformations in our global supply chains because of things like the pandemic, because of shifting policy with China. What does the future hold? And again, I'm broadly about everything from biopharma to software. I'd say the first step really is we need to be able to illuminate our supply chains. Right? A recent survey showed that only 6% of companies have full visibility into their supply chains. And if you don't know what's actually in your supply chain, there's no way to effectively manage your risk or exposure. I think we're no longer in a position where you can just ignore everything behind you in your supply chain because there's been sufficient examples of disruption that there's risk there that we need to manage. And so the first step is illuminating your supply chain. I think a great example I think we're going to talk about next is the software bill of material. This was kind of a key part of the cybersecurity executive order last summer that really pushed the federal government to adopt SBOM. And SBOM is really just a standardized way of representing metadata about a piece of software and the other pieces of software that went into it. So modern software development is less about writing code from whole cloth. It's more about bundling together software libraries written by other people. And even the glue that is being used to hook those software libraries together is being generated by AI. There's some fascinating things that are happening in the software engineering ecosystem. And so SBOM becomes critically important because it gives you the traceability of all of the different Lego building blocks that went into the application you're installing on your computer or the service you're consuming from the cloud. And that's really, again, just the first step. We have to know what is behind the scenes, what's under the hood in the software that we're using. Interesting question of whether other industries should adopt similar sorts of practices. Is there an SBOM equivalent in the biopharma space or in the agriculture and food space? I don't know, if you go to a restaurant, is there a QR code next to each item on the menu where you can pull up a digitally signed list of where every ingredient in your meal came from? All right. Certainly the sort of organic movement has aspects of that, but really talking about that on steroids. Lots of interesting new technologies that potentially could play a role. I know blockchain is really now hitting the mainstream and is available as really infrastructure on the internet writ large. And so there's lots of startups out there now trying to develop tools based on technologies like blockchain that would allow you to track aspects of these supply chains. Independent of an organization really illuminating its own supply chain, there are efforts by third parties to illuminate supply chains. And so there's a ton of data out there, either on the internet or available for sale, everything from federal contract data and subcontract data to purchase order data, shipping manifests. Like, if you're able to pull all this data together in a sophisticated way, you actually can illuminate use that to illuminate certain sectors and understand other folks' supply chains. And so increasingly we're seeing interest from, say, the US government and Department of Defense in particular in getting a better handle on the supply chain for military electronics, for example, using some of these kinds of tools and getting more sophisticated in the way that we employ data analysis. Once you illuminate the supply chain, though, it doesn't necessarily tell you whether that supply chain is good or bad. So next up, you have to evaluate whether or not what you've just illuminated is good, is a risk you're willing to take. Is there actually a threat there to manage? And that's still, I think, an open question in terms of how much risk you're willing to absorb. Interesting example, again, back in the 5G space around Huawei was the State Department came out with a policy under Pompeo called Clean Networks. And the idea was that US embassies abroad would not use any telecommunications circuit that connected them back to the United States if that circuit traversed any Huawei equipment. So that's a very binary decision that is presuming a very heightened risk and threat associated with Huawei equipment carrying embassy traffic. And so that's an example of basically making that risk determination, that you feel that the threat is so significant, the risk is so high that we want to excise certain things entirely from the supply chain of that delivers our data from US embassies abroad to the United States. But I think the question, that level of heightened threat and heightened risk is not always necessarily justified. I think at MITRE, for example, we have this whole notion around threat-informed defense, the MITRE attack framework that many of you may be familiar with. It really seeks to help better understand the threat, understand what the adversaries are actually doing, because I think it would be impossible to build any sort of economically efficient supply chain if you presumed everything was a risk and everything was a threat. And so again, there's this balance that we need between risk and threat management and sort of economic efficiency and cost. Again, back to SBOM, our software bill of material. Right now there's language in, I think, the NDAA that says that for DHS purchased software, it must have an SBOM for certain critical components of the network, and that none of the components listed in that SBOM should have any active CVEs, Common Vulnerability Enumeration, also a MITRE developed capability for DHS. So that is another example of how you can use that illumination to then make a policy decision about deciding what's good or bad. I suspect this is going to be an interesting journey for DHS as it tries to implement this policy. I would wager that once we start getting systematically available SBOMs for every products we use today, there's going to be all kinds of dirty laundry we discover inside them, and getting to a point where you can actually buy a product that has no vulnerable libraries within it is going to take a while. So this could end up being a denial of service attack against DHS, but it's going to take a while, I think, for the effects of this to really work its way into the software ecosystem. But again, I applaud it as a great first step of really starting to think through, okay, now we're going to have an SBOM, what do we do with it? Well, making sure that nothing in the SBOM is vulnerable is a great next step, but realize it's going to take a while for all that to kind of work its way through the system. I think another thing, though, is just because we don't know that a particular piece of code is vulnerable because of an enumerated known threat, doesn't mean there aren't risks there. So there's lots of other things we should think about when evaluating the risk of components of an SBOM, for example. Is it open source? Is it closed source? And there's kind of two philosophies about which one is more trustworthy, right? Open source has its own set of risks of having a community that maintains it. That community could be large, it could be and sophisticated, it could be small, it could be just one guy who's been working on this. Like Log4j is a great example of a critical software library that was really didn't have enough of a maintainer community and ended up having a vulnerability in it that affected software in a really huge and systematic way. Again, back to whether it's open source or not, are you concerned that someone's going to somehow put malicious code into your libraries? Also, interestingly, a couple weeks ago, GitHub, one of the big public repositories of open source software, somebody went in and basically copied a whole bunch of software repositories for widely used open source applications. They took the entire code base, kind of checked it out, then created a new project and checked it in. And that new project had a very similar name to the original one, but then they embedded malicious code inside those copies. And so if you went off to just go try and download a particular open source library through GitHub, and you weren't paying enough attention and realized that, I don't know, the name of the software library was one character different, you wouldn't realize that you're downloading now this malicious with embedded, implanted code in it, specifically designed to establish a beachhead on whatever computer you installed it on. So again, not necessarily a CVE in the package that we're using, but there's risk we need to manage, and I think the open source community upon which the majority of the internet rests today is again not a well-funded big enterprise system, right? It's a very organic, messy, innovative, creative ecosystem, and we need to really understand how we interface with that. And if we do perceive risks there, it's not just we shouldn't use it, but it's how do we as an industry help bolster it to help manage and reduce those risks. A third area in terms of what we do with all of this would be really reshaping our supply chains. So this gets to areas like semiconductors, where we have this significant concern that dependence on China for our chips is bad for the US. And so what we can do is really work to terraform our supply chains. And in the semiconductor space, we've got the Chips and Science Act that passed, I guess now a few weeks ago. And in there is $52 billion to really help bolster the U.S. domestic production of semiconductors. Right, so there's $39 billion to provide subsidies for the U.S. manufacture of chips. And keep in mind that when we talk particularly about microelectronics supply chain, everyone typically is thinking about the latest and greatest, fanciest fab to make the chips that go in your cell phone. But much of the supply chain disruption we've seen over the last, let's say, few years, particularly in areas like automotive, are not these high-end leading-edge nodes, as they're called, but it's the older process technology. It's the more mature and legacy nodes where we're having some of these supply chain issues. Again, and there's really not much margin on these older parts, and so there's no real incentive to make them here, right? We can rely on other countries to produce them because they're kind of old and commodity and not the latest and greatest anymore. So companies like Intel here in the US are very focused on the leading edge node and getting the latest and greatest process technology. But as we think about onshoring our microelectronic supply chain, again, it's this whole ecosystem from older, newer, and everything in between, and the R&D that goes with it. Also in there is $11 billion for two major R&D centers, one in semiconductors and one in packaging, which will really try and help spur the U.S. to be ahead of China in the development of the next generation of semiconductor technology. So that's an example of onshoring our R&D supply chain as well. So we're relying less on foreign innovation and more on our own to keep pace with the global market. Interesting question, though, is will these subsidies be enough? $39 billion. If it costs 30 to 40% more to fabricate a chip in the U.S., that $39 billion will help give us some runway. But if once the subsidies run out, does the business case fall apart? Right. So that's an interesting question of can we leverage the subsidies to really kickstart things, but then build a sustainable model that has a U.S. onshore semiconductor community that will sustain itself economically into the future. And I think the key to that really is making sure that the U.S. is not just a supplier to itself, but really becomes a global supplier of microelectronics. You've got to get the economies of scale in order to really help manage the high capital costs of the journey we're about to undertake in semiconductors. And there's certainly other industries where we're looking to really terraform our supply chains in order to reduce risk. Certainly COVID showed us lots of examples of things that we could have less risk to society if we manufacture them in the US, even if they cost a little bit more. I'd say the fourth area is, outcompete China, right? So if China's got all these new ideas, they've gone from sort of being stealing our intellectual property and being copycats now to out-innovating us, right, and being ahead of us in many areas. If we want to help reduce the risk of Chinese inventions being part of the supply chain, we need to out-innovate them. And so I mentioned the Chips and Science Act. The CHIPS part's getting a lot of attention, but there's also significant increased funding for every single one of the federal science agencies as part of that bill, authorized, not yet appropriated. So there's still more work to do to actually get the money that was authorized in that bill turned into actual federal budget. But it's all these areas of critical technology that we want to reduce the risk of and onshore more of. So I mentioned some of these ideas about using big data to try and illuminate supply chains. There's lots of things that we may discover when we do that illumination. So kind of the fifth area is, can we actively interdict bad behavior in our supply chains? So if we're able to illuminate and we're able to now start identifying bad actors who are maliciously trying to manipulate our supply chains, particularly, say, for defense components, what do we do about it, right? We've had a fairly blunt instrument in the sanctions regime over the last 5 years. I think we've gotten a little more sophisticated in terms of how we deploy our sanctions, but there's a lot more sophistication, I think, that we could bring to the table through data analytics. If you marry the supply chain illumination with a more sophisticated treatment of sanctions, I think we can be a lot more surgical in how we employ them. Great example would be, again, back in the 5G space, we had a bunch of sanctions against Chinese companies. The sanctions kind of went both ways. So if we stop importing Chinese components, what happens when they start banning U.S. components? Companies like Qualcomm, like half of their chip sales are going to Chinese companies making cell phones. And so from an economic perspective, we can shoot ourselves in the foot if we're not careful with how we deploy sanctions, because if they're done in a way that's not well thought through or coarse, the outcome can often be worse than doing nothing at all. And so my hope is that this supply chain illumination allows us to more surgically identify and attribute bad behavior in those supply chains, which allows us to more surgically target sanctions to undermine our adversaries that are trying to manipulate our activities. And in fact, MITRE just launched this past summer the Center for Strategic Competition, and that's a major undertaking that they have right now, and have some really sophisticated capabilities to help with working across the interagency to shape and manage those sanction regimes. And then lastly is sort of a question of deterrence. So are our global supply chains really a way to strategically project power on the world stage, right? Historically, nuclear weapons have been the primary regime for holding at risk our adversaries. Increasingly, cybersecurity is now being viewed by many as a strategic instrument of national power. where we can essentially seek to deter other nations from, I don't know, hacking the U.S. electric grid by having the ability to hack theirs. And so this concept of deterrence is interesting, and to a certain extent, right, China is sufficiently entrenching themselves in the global supply chain that they can hold at risk many economies around the world if they wanted to. And is there a way for us to perhaps think on the offense about how we might do the same? And I think concepts like that, particularly in the supply chain space, are starting to grow in interest in policy circles. So anyway, we get to a position of mutually assured destruction in global supply chain. It's kind of terrifying, but these are the kinds of thoughts that I think are now bouncing around, and all part of a complex tapestry of how we might manage our risk. So with that, that's the end of my remarks. It was great to chat with anyone. I don't know, is there Q&A?
Anyone who would like to come to the right of the question? You need to turn the mic on.
Yeah, there's a green light. Okay, it's on.
There we go.
I've been involved in data management only recently, since 1969. And I'm the secretary of the Database Languages Committee, so me and about 10 other guys invented SQL. The most important thing about the way we brought SQL to the market was that NIST, which used to stand for standards, had an ability to validate that, in fact, every SQL DBMS that was sold to the federal government conformed to a very, very precise profile. Back in the middle of 1995, NIST decided that was a useless activity on their part, and so they disemboweled is the right word, I think, any conformance testing of any SQL engine from any SQL vendor through the federal market, and by definition then through the public market. Mm-hmm. And so therefore so there are whole agencies that are Oracle agencies or Informix agencies or DB2 agencies or whatever, but there is zero guarantee that the same database structure with the same data with the same query language will produce the same result. And no one seems to care. That's, I don't know, I was at MITRE from 91 to 95, and that was at the end of 95 when I left. That's when all this whole thing crashed and burned. And we tried very hard, all the main vendors tried very, very hard to get NIST to come back to the table and do what was necessary for the federal government. And I don't know anybody here, but that's true. But I meant in terms of everyone's products, probably almost all use SQL engines. And the question is, are you sure they all are producing the same answers? I can be assured to tell you they're not.
Yeah.
And I think something has to happen on that regard.
Well, first, you guys should have figured out the percent versus asterisk for wildcards. The lack of standardization there drove me crazy as a software developer early in my career. But no, I agree. I mean, the world of test and evaluation is, the DoD is facing this now with software in general. Now with AI, it's even more complicated because you've got products that have a particular behavior, even if you do a test and evaluation and on them, but they have machine learning baked in and their behavior changes over time. How do you test against future behaviors that it hasn't even learned yet? So I'd say the entire test and evaluation and a community is trying to figure out what it means to operate in the sort of in a new future where I know unit tests don't give you really a good picture on the behavior of a large system of systems.
But you first have to start off with tests.
Mm-hmm.
And they abandoned that. In the late 1970s, when I was only in my 40s, two of the biggest database management system vendors were operating in the federal government, and I was involved with both of them. And I noticed some anomaly, and I turned around and I structured a very precise set of testing that demonstrated to both of them that they were producing the wrong answers, and both of them, quote unquote, defended to the death that their answers were correct. And they were radically wrong, or radically different. I have no idea what the definition of wrong is. They were radically different. So this is an area which I used to be in J81, which is the software center here. And I think MITRE needs to come back to the table in terms of data management conformance testing. And if you'd like a copy of all the conformance tests,
Okay.
I have them.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Andy Purdy with Huawei. I appreciate you all holding this conference. I've been coming here for probably nearly 20 years, and again, it's a great session. I appreciate your remarks. I'll skip over my first 8 or 10 comments. I want to ask a question, but I want to make a comment. One thing that astounds me with 10 years in Huawei, and there's no reason you all would see this, the things that we have offered to do, and I'm not talking about our ability to do business in the United States, because that's has not been and is not material to us. But what we've offered to do, what we've offered to share, is astounding. And there has never been a situation where somebody has come back to us and said, okay, share this, talk with us about this, cooperate with us about this. And it's just crazy. And if you look at things like our hardcore science research on Shannon's limit and Moore's law, a perfect example of our willingness to share information on that to help increase the connectivity of our ability to do 5.5G and 6G. And what we're doing in digitalization of energy, again, not to do business in the US, but to share information. We're getting tremendous progress to help meet the ITU 2030 guidelines for carbon neutral, carbon negative, hopefully, for ITC or ICT. But let me ask you this question. So the lessons we hopefully are learning from SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange Server, the trusted suppliers, and as we move forward with zero trust, fortunately, and obviously it long predates the important stuff in the executive order, and the work of SBOM. So the importance of transparency. How much more should be done, whether or not a company or entity is trusted? And how much less can be done to allow products of trusted companies into the marketplace?
Yeah, so I would observe that it gets back to a very blunt policy regime. As a lot of the conversations were happening about banning certain Chinese companies, it was difficult to legislate a complex risk management regime, right? So at the time, the solution was basically to bin companies as trusted or untrusted, and as a result, have a very binary choice about who you worked with and who you didn't. And that is, I think, an oversimplistic view of how you should reflect on your supply chain and the products that you use, right? And I think there's risk. There's all sorts of risks. And it's a question of what risks can we manage, where do we see threats that are unmanageable, and what do we do in the market to help create less risk overall. And I think those are exactly the kinds of questions that this group should be grappling with. And I think we'll have some interesting discussions today. All right.